Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Labels Beyond the Basics, brought to you by Pest Management Professional Magazine and our sponsor of the event, Control Solutions. I'm Danielle Pesta from North Coast Media, the digital editor for Pest Management Professional, and I will be your event manager for today's presentation. Before we get started, I want to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded. You are currently in a listen-only mode. A recording of this webinar will be posted to mypmp.net/webinars and will be also emailed to you tomorrow. At this time, I'd like to get you comfortable with our console and the ways you can participate during today's presentation. Please notice the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your console. If you have a question, type it in the panel's text box, then click Submit to place your question in queue. You may also use the hashtag PMPWebinar on Twitter to submit questions during today's event or to enter into discussions with other attendees. We encourage you to ask and enter any questions you may have for our speaker during the presentation. We will address these questions at the end during the Q&A portion. Questions submitted during registration have already gone to our speaker and may be covered during the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, you may use the same Q&A panel on your screen to submit your issue, and assistant producer Grace Ryback or I will personally assist you. You may learn more about today's speaker and moderator by viewing their photo, bio, and contact information in the panel located in the upper left-hand corner of your console. Below the speaker information, there is a Contact Us panel in the bottom left for you to send any follow-up remarks to our moderator via email. These inquiries will not be addressed during the live event. If you are logged into your social media accounts, you can share this webinar's title, description, and URL with your friends or colleagues using the Share This widget that is placed below the slides. Also below the slides, the Refer a Colleague panel will allow you to email today's webinar information to a coworker or other industry professional. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to today's moderator, PMP editor Heather Gooch.
Thank you, Danielle, and welcome everyone to our webinar on taking your label knowledge beyond the basics. We have a fantastic speaker lined up for you today. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Control Solutions, Inc., or CSI, for making today's webinar possible. Today, Dr. Janis Reed, a board-certified entomologist and the technical services manager for CSI, will discuss the intricacies of labels and label language to ultimately make you and your team better at understanding labels. Dr. Reed has served as the staff entomologist and technical director with a large, independently owned pest management company. She also has years of research and pesticide education experience. Dr. Reed earned her bachelor's, master's, and doctorate in entomology with a focus on urban entomology from Texas A&M University. Her research and interests include social insects, especially ants, as well as the foraging and feeding preferences of insects. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today, Dr. Reed. We're looking forward to your thoughts on this topic, which is always pertinent to pest management professionals' success and effectiveness. So now I will turn it over to you, Dr. Reed.
Hi, thanks, Heather, and thank you, PMP, for hosting us today. We really appreciate the partnership we have with you. So as you mentioned, today we're going to be talking about labels beyond the basics. And what I hope to really get across is a growth in the ability for anyone listening to read and comprehend a label. We're going to go through a few label basics, what they mean to different people. What does registration mean? We hear about pesticides being registered. What does that mean? We're going to refer to the phrase, the label is the law, a lot today, so get used to hearing that. Then we're going to get into Beyond 101 label reading, label changes, label requirements, and finally, label language and understanding that language. So when you first got into the pest management industry, probably on day one, but almost definitely week one, you learned some basic common label information. How to find a brand name, how to find active ingredients, where to find the first aid statement, what an EPA registration number is, and how is it different from an establishment number, signal words and what they mean. But you might have also been exposed to this saying: the label is the law. A lot of us throw this around and we say this on a regular basis to people. Well, follow the label is the law. But what I hope today is to expand your knowledge on what exactly the label is the law means. So since that initial training and you read a label for the first time, have you really sat down and read a label since? And I mean really read a label, from the active ingredient statement to the final information at the end of that label. When was the last time you really did that? And instead of just quickly opening a label, finding what you want to find, whether it's the pest, the rate, the site, or whatever question you have, and close it again. I think many of us are very guilty of doing exactly that: opening a label, finding what we're looking for, closing it again, and really not reading labels comprehensively. It's important to read all the labels for the products that you use and understand that label prior to using that pesticide every time. You shouldn't rely on memory, and you shouldn't rely on what the label said the last time you used it. And we're going to talk about why that is. So let's talk about a few basics. So the first one is the definition of a pesticide. And I know we talk about pesticides, but we really need to define what a pesticide is, both to us and to the EPA. So let's take a look at this definition. And I know I hate it when people read slides to me, so I apologize for this, but we are going to read through this one. A pesticide is any substance or mixture of substances intended to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate any pest, or intended for use as a plant regulator, defoliant, or desiccant. So this is a pretty broad definition, and it covers pretty much anything that we might use in our industry in the activity of controlling a pest. Now let's contrast that with a pesticide product, because that's what we actually use. We very rarely, how about never, are exposed to pesticide active ingredients in their pure form. What we get to use are pesticide products. And these are pesticides in the particular form, including composition, packaging, labeling, all the things that we think of. When you go into a pesticide distributor's office and you see shelves and shelves of materials, those are pesticide products. It's in which the pesticide is or intended to be distributed or sold. So most of the time what we're talking about is not really a pesticide. Technically, it's a pesticide product. And you'll hear manufacturers say, our products, because we're not talking about selling strict AIs, we're talking about providing pesticide products to the industry. Now, the last of kind of the basic things I want to make sure we cover before we move on to some of the Beyond 101 stuff is classification of pesticides. Now, the EPA classifies every pesticide they register as either general use or restricted use. And typically, if a pesticide is registered and it's restricted use, it'll carry this information at the very top front panel of the pesticide label, as you can see with this QualiPro product here, restricted use pesticide. And what this means is there are restrictions to the people who can buy, sell, and use these products. So just kind of wanted to cover some of those basic things before we move on to some of the more advanced stuff we're going to talk about today. So as we get in, I want to talk about labels specifically and what they are, because depending on who you are in the industry, labels are very different things. So for example, to a manufacturer, it's the license to sell the product. We can legally take that product out into the world and sell it. To the government, it's a way to control the use of the product. It's a way to control who gets it, how they get it, where they get it, who can sell it, who can't. To a physician, it's a source of information on the proper treatment. And finally, to you, the end user, it's a source of information on proper use. So now, anytime I talk about the government as it pertains to controlling pesticides, the governmental agency I'm really talking about is the EPA. And the EPA is tasked with a number of things as it pertains to pesticides. And when they review pesticides, they review them based on a number of factors, including scientific processes, legal, and administrative ones. They also assess human health risks, environmental effects, including effects to wildlife, fish, plants, water, runoff, drift, and leaching, all before they make a decision about whether or not a pesticide should be registered. They get all of their power, they're mandated to do this by the Federal Insecticide and Fungicide and Rodenticide Act, which you might have heard before, FIFRA. So all of the power that the EPA wields as it pertains to pesticide registration, they get from this act, this FIFRA Act that you might have heard of before. So the label itself, not the product, is actually registered by the EPA. I mean, they're both registered, but the label has to be approved as much as the product does. When a manufacturer goes through to create a new pesticide product, label and register it, that process can take years and years, 7 to 9 years in best case scenario, and can cost millions of dollars, sometimes tens of millions of dollars. And there's a lot of things that factor into that cost. The active ingredient that's chosen, has it been used or registered before? Has it been used in that form before? So like, let's say you're registering a liquid. Has that product been sold as a liquid? Next, what pests will be labeled? There's a lot of requirements if a manufacturer wants to list certain pests versus others to the EPA. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. The label also includes registered uses. And I know you've seen this. For example, indoors, outdoors, can I use it on turf or grass? Can I use it as a general surface treatment, or is it crack and crevice only? You might have specific sites listed on the label, and all of that is the intended use. And if the intended use is not on the label, it shouldn't be used. And you, the applicator at the end of the day, are legally responsible for any misuse, misapplication, or non-target applications. So we're coming back to this statement. I told you we would. The label is the law. You're forbidden to use a pesticide contrary to its labeling, and I think we all understand that. The label is the law. But where does this come from? This term comes from this particular section of a label, sometimes under the directions for use, usually. It says, it is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. That is where we shorten the phrase, the label is the law, and why we go back to that so many times, because we are forbidden to use pesticide contrary to its labeling. And if we do that, we've done something that is against federal law, and that is the section of the label that pertains to. So let's move on to the Beyond 101 section of this course. And some of this is coming from my own personal experience, things I've gotten wrong through the years, and this is the first one. When I started in industry and somebody explained to me the difference between a label and labeling, I thought it was different than the truth. So we're going to talk about what the actual truth is. So a label is the written, printed, or graphic material on or attached to the pesticide device, its containers, or its wrappers. All right, so I want you to really think about this. The label, when we say the label is the law, we are talking about the label that's attached to the products that you buy. Now, let's contrast that with labeling. Labeling is all labels, written, printed, graphic, electronic, that accompany the pesticide at any time or with references made on the label or in literature. So if you download a label from the manufacturer's website, if you find a label in an old specimen label book from 2002 in your truck, if you find a label that was taken off an old container, that could all be considered labeling. The true label is the one attached to the bottle of which you are using. We'll talk about more why that's important in a little while. Now, collateral labeling is what I thought labeling was. And these are bulletins, leaflets, circulars, brochures, data sheets, flyers, any other written material that's provided with the product, including websites, including anything the manufacturer might provide to support that product, is actually collateral labeling. And it's very different from the actual label. So it's important to keep those different in your mind when you are thinking back to the label is the law. Now this one I threw in because I found it interesting, and that's a sublabel. Now a sublabel is a subset of approved uses under a given master label. Now this is really common in like household products, things you buy at the big box stores or your local hardware store. They will register a single product, and associated with that product might be 15, 16, 17, or more sublabels. And what that allows a company to do is sell the same juice, basically, the same product in different bottles for different uses. So if you look at the names of these products over here, one is meant for fire ant and lawn care, and another is meant for tomatoes and vegetables. And obviously the use directions for those two products are going to vary dramatically versus an application to a lawn and an application on tomatoes and vegetables. So those labels are different, but at the end of the day, they fall under the exact same EPA registration number. And those sublabels are all part of a master label. Again, just something I found interesting, thought you guys might as well. So again, going back, the label is the law. So when using a pesticide product, you follow the directions on the label, right? But which label? The one attached to the pesticide product. If you are referencing a printed label that you have in your truck, you could be referencing the exact wrong label for that particular product. So it's important. When I say to read a label, I mean read the one attached to the product in which you are going to use it. The reason for this is labels are living documents. These are not biblical set-in-stone documents that never change. I'll give you some examples of changes that have occurred in the past. Labels can be changed at any time by manufacturers or the EPA. And those changes vary why they're implemented, from adding a use. Perhaps the old label didn't have turf on it, or maybe they wanted to add a pest, or maybe they want to remove a restriction that doesn't need to be there, or maybe they need to add PPE or remove PPE. So those are things that manufacturers like to do or choose to do in a lot of cases. Changes can also be mandated by the EPA in the re-registration stage. And I'm going to talk more about this in a little while, but we just went through a re-registration or an interim decision on a couple of really commonly used pyrethroids, and you're going to see some label changes in the very near future. It's also very important to remember that labels vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. So if you're using a pesticide product and it has active ingredient X, and you go to pick up another product with the same active ingredient, those products can be remarkably different, even if they contain the exact same active ingredient. So it's important, again, to read the label attached to the bottle. So again, going back, you've heard read the label, but which label did you read? And I'm going to use Fuse as an example. CSI registered this product originally in 2013. And since then, we have updated, changed, and modified this label 5 times. So if you're still looking at a pesticide product label that was printed in, let's say, 2014, you could potentially be looking at a label that's 2 iterations ago. And there might have been pretty dramatic changes. I'll give you an example of some label changes that have happened recently. The EPA can require PPE requirements to change. For example, fipronil products in 2015 now require gloves with greater than 14 mil thickness, and this wasn't there prior to about 2015. The EPA can also require reduction in retreatment interval or applications that are allowed. So for example, you might see something on a label like, do not apply more than 2 applications per year with a minimum treatment of 21 days. And maybe before, the reapplication interval was 14 days. So the applications went down. And while these are nuanced on a label, if you're not following them, you can certainly get into trouble when you're using a product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. Now, I mentioned interim decisions. So all active ingredients are regularly evaluated by the EPA. And recently, as in the last 6 months, changes for a couple of really important pyrethroids were issued. The interim decisions were issued. So specifically for bifenthrin and deltamethrin, those interim decisions have been issued. We've also had some preliminary suggested changes for a couple of other active ingredients, including lambda-cyhalothrin and gamma-cyhalothrin. So again, these interim decisions, when they're issued, that means any product containing these active ingredients have to be updated with the new requirements. And again, you're going to start seeing these new requirements on labels in the next year. So what do these AI reviews mean to us? What do they mean to the pest control industry? Again, labels are going to change. And these decisions can take sometimes several years to implement throughout the entire process, from manufacture to distribution to getting into your warehouse. So always read and follow the label that's on the product packaging of which you are using. That's the safest way to stay in compliance. Use the label, follow the restrictions, follow the rules on the product on which you are using. So why does the EPA go through these reviews, and what requires an EPA to review something? Well, the first is anytime there's a new active ingredient. If that active ingredient isn't currently registered, the EPA automatically has to review everything about that product. If a new use is being presented for a particular product, maybe it's a product that's been in our industry, we've used it extensively. If we have a new use added to the product, we have to consider it reviewed, and it has to be reviewed. So anytime you're adding a new site or a new pest that's not currently registered, the EPA has to review all that data. If you are doing a new form or a new product for registering a new AI, then you have to have a review by the EPA. If anything requires efficacy data, so for example, if you're wanting to list a public health pest on your label, all rodenticides, antimicrobials, and mycotoxins all require efficacy review by the EPA. And then finally, if you're going to do an experimental use permit and you're going to cover more than 10 acres, you're probably going to have a review. And then finally, the EPA re-registers all active ingredients that were registered prior to November 1, 1984. And they try to do this every 10 years-ish. The government, 10 years is a long time, but they don't always make that exact 10-year line. But they do try to review everything every 10 years. And that's when you'll see these changes. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about label requirements and label languages. So label requirements. There's a lot of funny requirements that I really never knew about what had to be on a pesticide label, and even how big the font had to be. So for example, labels have to be securely attached to the pesticide product, and they have to have a minimum of a 6-point font. Now, when I was younger, this didn't matter so much, but now that I'm getting a little older, I'll tell you that 6-point font sometimes is not so easy to read, and I think the EPA is considering that when they have this particular rule. So if you are printing labeling, so perhaps on a very small container, such as the small Dachshund Precise cartridge, none of the font on that cartridge can go below 6-point font. I know everyone listening is familiar with labels that have a pull-off booklet label. Most of the liquid insecticides you buy have a booklet that comes off. So what is required based on labels in the EPA for the securely attached or the pull-off labeling? So I've kind of broken it down. This is just a few of the things, but you can see there are some things that are required to be on the label that is attached to the container, and other things that can be on that detachable booklet, and some things that are not required to be on that detachable booklet. So let's look at the ones that are different. So the first one is storage and disposal. As you can see, that needs to be attached to the container, and that makes sense. If the booklet gets torn off, we still need directions on how to store and properly dispose of that pesticide and pesticide container. The next thing is the ingredient statement. Absolutely must be on the label attached to the container, because again, if that booklet gets separated, you still need to know what is inside that bottle. So those are things that are required to be attached to the container versus the detachable booklet. Then finally, the only thing that's not required to be on the attached container is the directions for use, because those are in the detachable booklet. You know, obviously that takes up the bulk of the label language, so that doesn't need to be attached to the product. So manufacturer name and address, product name and brand, signal word, precautionary statements, and the EPA registration and establishment number both must appear in both places. All right, so let's jump into some parts of the label or requirements that you maybe haven't reviewed before, or maybe you could just use a little bit of a refresher on. So the first is what we say is a site state. So federal law allows for the application of a pesticide against a pest which is not listed on the label as long as you have the site and application. So let's use an example of, I want to control a pest that is eating my crepe myrtle in my front yard. And the pest is a pin-headed rock borer that is getting into my crepe myrtles. And a pin-headed rock borer doesn't exist, I just made that up. Okay, so pin-headed rock borers are attacking my crepe myrtles. Well, pin-headed rock borers are not listed on any pesticide label in the United States because, as again, that particular example is a made-up pest. But let's pretend it wasn't. It was a real bug, and it's not listed on the label that I have. But the label allows for an application in residential settings and on ornamental bushes and trees. So the application site and the type of application is listed on the label, but pin-headed rock borers are not. According to federal law, I would still be able to make that application because I have met those site requirements. Now, it's important to understand that some states don't allow this. They do not allow sites to overarch all of those uses. For example, New York State, the pest and the site must be listed on the label. So it's important to know your local state laws and what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Because if you're just following federal laws, you might get yourself in trouble in that the label is the law fashion. The next thing I want to talk about is what is a spot treatment. Many labels say, apply this product as a spot or crack and crevice application in this and such areas and da-da-da-da-da. So what exactly is a spot treatment? I've heard 2 square feet many times. The EPA defines it as 2 square feet. So which of these boxes shows 2 square feet? Can you guess? So the EPA definition, a spot is not to exceed 2 square feet. Application is limited to areas on which insects are likely to occur, but not contact food or utensils and will not be ordinarily contacted by people. So 2 square feet. That one is 2 square feet. The one on the bottom is 2 feet by 2 feet, but that's actually 4 square feet. So that's twice the size of a spot as defined by the EPA. So if you're going to make a spot treatment, it needs to be limited to 1 foot by 2 feet or some mathematical equivalent of 1 foot to 2 feet. That is the definition of a spot treatment. So it's important if you are choosing to make spot applications, you're staying within those legal requirements. So the next thing we're going to talk about is advisory statements and mandatory versus advisory. So mandatory statements will usually have things like do not or users must or apply at a maximum of. So for example, the Proflex label says for indoor applications, do not reapply Proflex at less than 21-day intervals. So this is a mandatory statement set forth by the EPA that says if I'm going to make an indoor applications with Proflex, I can't do it but once every 21 days. Now there are many other things on the label that allow technicians or PMPs to make some flexible applications. So for example, Proflex may be applied using a paintbrush. You don't have to apply it using a paintbrush, but in such instances where you're worried about drift or dripping or some other issue, it allows you to apply it that way. These advisory statements are usually descriptive or non-directive, things like reapplication may be made, or it's a good practice to make applications in this manner. Again, these are helpful hints sometimes to the PMPs, or giving them flexibility for different application styles that aren't, let's just say, common. Mandatory statements relate to actions that are necessary to ensure the proper use of the pesticide, and they are enforceable. So they're enforceable by your state lead agency and the federal government. Advisory statements provide information on the product's use, characteristics, how to properly or maximize safety and efficacy when applying the product. They're usually accompanied by something like, this is why this should be done. Use this if this, and this is why. And those are advisory statements. Now, in my opinion, probably the most important section of any pesticide label, other than the use directions, are the use restrictions, the mandatory use restrictions. Now again, I'm going to use Proflex as an example here again, because there's a few use restrictions that I consider very important. First, do not allow children or pets to contact treated surfaces until the spray has dried. Next, for indoor applications, do not reapply Proflex at less than 21-day intervals. Do not use this product with oil. Do not apply this product in a room that's being used as living, eating, or sleeping, or a recovery area by patients, the elderly, or infirm while they're in the room. Do not apply to institutions, including libraries, sports facilities, etc., in the immediate area when occupants are present. Do not apply to classrooms while in use. Do not use this product on edible or growing plants or stored agricultural commodities. Do not allow applications to contact water. So some of these are pretty standard, but some of them are important. If you're making an application in a medical facility, we need to make sure there's nobody in the room at the time, no patients at the room at the time. So again, it's important to know these restrictions. And again, I really feel like this is the place where PMPs can really get into trouble because use restrictions specifically say, do not do this. The next thing we're going to talk about is precautionary statements and first aid. Now again, this is one of the things we covered on day 1/week 1. You were taught this is a precautionary statement, this is a first aid statement. But you might notice on a few labels, like maybe there is no first aid statement. And you're like, well, why is there no first aid statement? Very strange. They're required when acute toxicity studies are categories 1, 2, or 3. If a product is classified as category 4, then that first aid statement is not required. And this is why you'll see labels without a first aid statement. So if you have a very low tox product, you'll see no first aid statement. And everything's correct. It's not required by the EPA. The next thing I want to talk about is inert ingredients. So inert ingredients are generally substances other than active ingredients that are intentionally added to a pesticide product. These things manufacturers add like emulsifiers, fragrances, solvents, carriers, colorants sometimes. A lot of different things that can go into a product that have nothing to do with a pesticide active ingredient. There's a lot of confusion out there about what the EPA knows and what the EPA expects about inert ingredients. But I have to let you know that the EPA, for every single pesticide that is registered, must include in their packet a confidential statement of formula. This is submitted to the EPA as part of the registration process because inerts are part of this process. The EPA also has a list of inert ingredients You can look at it online called Inert Finder, and some are listed for food and non-food use. Some of them are listed as non-food areas only. There are fragrance active ingredients, but you can find every inert product that is in a pesticide in this Inert Finder. And I know that there's confusion about, well, we're hiding things in our active ingredients, and we're hiding, we're including active ingredients in inert. That doesn't happen. The EPA gets a list of everything that goes in our formulation as part of that confidential statement of formula, and I guarantee you manufacturers are not hiding active ingredients in that list. The next thing we're going to talk about is mode of action and the IRAC statements on labels. More and more general pest control labels are including the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, or IRAC, groups to indicate the product's mode of action. This is to assist applicators in resistance management. So again, I'm going to use Proflex again over here on the right. You can see Proflex contains 3 active ingredients: lambda-cyhalothrin, novaluron, and pyriproxyfen. And you can see each of them are listed with their group number as assigned by IRAC. So we have groups for lambda-cyhalothrin, and then the different groups for the IGR components in this label. It's important when you're making decisions on pesticide active ingredients and pesticide products, you shouldn't choose your products based on a brand, based on a brand name, or based on the manufacturer being different. Make sure you're choosing based on the mode of action. And these statements, these boxes showing up on pesticide labels, are making that easier and easier for general pest control. All right, now this one is a question I get so much that I feel like it's a really nice thing to include in this Beyond the Basics webinar, and that is the difference between a label and a safety data sheet. Now, if you take a look at this example, this happens to be an aerosol product called Defense NXT. As you look at the pesticide label on the left, you'll note the signal word of caution. Now, if you take a look at the information on the kind of the right hand or the center, you'll note the signal word on the safety data sheet is danger. So why does the label say one thing and the safety data sheet say something completely different? The difference is labels and label language are overseen by FIFRA, and SDS language is overseen by OSHA, a completely different set of laws and a completely separate federal agency. In 2015, OSHA changed its standards to be in alignment with the globally harmonized system of classification. This is when we went from changing, and we called safety data sheets material safety data sheets, MSDSs, and now we just call them SDSs. A lot of this was due to this alignment with the globally harmonized system. The SDS is not intended for use by the general consumer. It's intended for people working with the material in an occupational setting, such as manufacturing and shipping. Now, I get a lot of questions about this because people say, well, I'm using this product as part of my occupation, so therefore shouldn't I follow the safety data sheet? Not really. PPE requirements for safety data sheets are really in reference to people that are manufacturing the product and shipping the product, handling large quantities of it. So that should be followed by them. Labeling should be followed, the label and labeling should be followed by PMPs. PPE requirements and signal words are different for occupational handling as we are manufacturing large quantities versus using the product, one individual aerosol can, for example, in the field. So next thing we're going to kind of chat about are excluded pests. Now, you've probably seen this on a label. So, for example, indoor treatments, cockroaches, ants, excluding fire, farrow, harvester, and carpenter, and crickets, and then what to do. So, obviously, this means the product doesn't work on those pests, right? Not necessarily. So often, this language just means that the registrant didn't provide efficacy data for these pests. So what does that mean, Janis? Well, the EPA has a list of pests of significant public health importance. And if a pest is listed on that list, efficacy data must be submitted for it to be included on the label of the target pest. So for example, let's go back a slide and let's look at this. Ants, excluding fire, farrow, harvester, and carpenter. I bet you can guess what 4 ants are considered public health ants by the EPA. You're probably right if you're guessing fire, farrow, harvester, and carpenter ants. And again, does it mean that this product doesn't work on those ants? Not necessarily, but it means that they're not listed on the label. So again, then we go back to, can I use it for those pest ants? Well, do you live in a site state? If you live in a site state and you want to make an application in a place, a site, and a situation on which is listed on the label, you could then apply it for those pests, but they're not listed on the label. So that's why the site is an important factor. So again, that list of pests of significant public health importance, not just ants on that list. Cockroaches are listed, mosquitoes, body, head, and crab lice, various rats and mice and other vertebrates. A lot of microorganisms are listed on that pest of significant public health. I bet you can guess one, i.e. COVID-19. Reptiles and birds, there's a number of those listed, and also various other mammals. So if you come up with a product that is meant to control, mitigate, or repel any of these public health pests, guess what? You have to submit data to list them on the label. So now we're going to kind of change gears completely and talk about some examples of things that are special registrations, things that are different, things that are unusual. So the first one we're going to talk about are some registrations, allowances that are usually done by states. So federal and state regulations allow for special registrations in situations that are unusual, dangerous, or if a pest is especially damaging. These are usually very extreme, unusual circumstances in which these are allowed. The first one we're going to talk about is a 2EE. So 2EEs allow a company to recommend the use of a product that isn't labeled on a particular crop, animal, or site, or in a manner not permitted by the label, as long as it's not prohibited by the label. So for example, up in the upper northeast part of the world, they're dealing with a pest called the spotted lanternfly. Up until recently, this pest didn't exist in the United States, so obviously it's not going to be listed on pesticide labels for the most part. So CSI and a number of other companies have issued 2EEs for products to combat the spotted lanternfly. This particular 2EE is for a Dominion 2L product that we make specifically for the use against the spotted lanternfly. So again, that's what a 2EE is. It allows the recommendation of a product that's labeled on a crop or a site on something that is not prohibited by the label. The next thing we're going to talk about is a Section 18 emergency exemption. And these are emergency exemptions that are allowed when insects, weeds, or disease threaten a crop and there's no registered pesticide to control it. In Texas, we had one approved this year. And if you take a look at this one, it's for a particular antiviral product to be used on American Airlines aircraft and airport facilities in Texas. And this is effective August 24th, 2020, and expires August 24th, 2021. So you can imagine why this emergency exemption was allowed due to the COVID-19 virus. So what have we learned today? So the first thing I hope you walk away from this webinar is that labels change, that these are not static, written in stone documents that never change, that we have to make sure we're adhering to the requirements on the product label attached to the product we're using. Next thing, labels are complex, and they are user's manuals for pesticide products, and they're not going to get less complex. As a matter of fact, as we go through the years, EPA is adding more and more requirements that we have to include in each label. Labels are getting longer. Labels are getting wordier. Labels are getting more complex. So it's important we make a habit of reading these labels regularly. I mentioned to pay attention to those use restrictions. Pay special attention there because those are the places that are really easy to trip up and make some very important mistakes. If you have questions, if you want to know when was the last time this label was updated, if you want to know what changed, your manufacturer representatives can help. Reach out to them. Your distributors can help. Your state and national associations, they can help. And even your professional magazines can help. So reach out to those people and ask for help. That's what we're here for. So thanks for listening today. I appreciate your time. And I assure you none of this today was an April Fool's joke. It was all absolutely true and to the best of my knowledge, everything we want you guys to know. So thanks for listening. Now, go read a label. Have a great day.
Oh, no fooling. All right. Thank you, Dr. Reed. Let's see. Now it's time for some questions. They've got several good ones here. I'm going to throw the first one here. I don't think you did in this presentation. How often do labels change, would you say, on average?
Oh, that's a hard question. So it really depends. There are some products that get changed, seems like yearly, but there are other products that got registered 15 years ago and still have the original registration label language. So it really depends on the pesticide product and the manufacturer who's registered it. So it really depends. There isn't a really good rule of thumb, but if you know that an interim decision has been issued, you know that your labels have been updated.
Okay. All right. And when they do change, how do pest control firms usually get notified or updated? I mean, is it like you rely on your supplier and distributor reps, or how does that work exactly?
Typically, yes. That's why we have professional distribution. That's why we have our manufacturers' reps to notify you of these changes. Sometimes they're minor changes and aren't really worth a mention. Other times they're major changes, and hopefully your manufacturer's rep and hopefully your distribution contact people are telling you of these changes. But the easiest way to do it is on the EPA. If you want to Google, you can easily find this system. The EPA has a easy-to-use website, and all you have to do is Google pesticide product and label system, EPA, and it'll bring up a website where you can search by the EPA registration number, the product name, or the company name, and you can see when was the last time that product was updated.
Oh, wow. You just answered my next question, which is how to determine how to make sure you had the most current label. So that site would be probably our best bet then.
Yep, I'll repeat that. It's the EPA pesticide product and label system, and you can just Google that and it'll come right up, and you can search by whatever product you're using, and you can know exactly when the last time that label was updated.
Okay. All right. This is an interesting question here, Dr. Reed. Do you know of any instances where there was like a label goof, where there was conflicting language on a label because of updates and information not being properly updated?
I don't know of one specifically, but I assure they exist because people involved, right? I mean, we are talking about people looking at sometimes 50, 60-page documents, and it's easy to make a mistake. Luckily, we have, manufacturers reps. We have the EPA. So many people look at a label, but at the end of the day, mistakes happen, and the easiest way to fix them is to notify them if you find them. These are living documents, and they are written by people, so I'm sure occasionally there have been mistakes.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Dr. Reed, what is your opinion on whether it's okay to give customers specimen labels? Is that a good thing to do, or maybe something we shouldn't be making a practice of?
If a customer asks for a specimen label, you should absolutely give them one. I think it would be very bad form to not share information with your customers, but typically that is a business decision, what is required in your state, and if the customer asks for more information, what are you required to give them? And I think those things change from state to state to state. So it's important that you know your state laws and what your state requires when a customer asks for additional information.
Okay. All right. Let's see. If is there such a thing as grandfathering as far as if you have a product in stock and the label has changed, can you still use the product per the label on it, or should you be following the latest label updates to it?
I say follow the label on the product packaging that you have in your possession up to a point. So once those, like let's use the recent pyrethroid interim decisions that have been held down or handed down. New labels be created, those get submitted to the EPA, those labels then come back to the manufacturers, and those labels then become attached to new pesticide product. That right there is going to take, let's say, a year. I'm just making that number up. There's going to become a point at which that old product packaging, even if you have it, you still need to refer to the newest product labeling. So, you might be able to get away with keeping that bottle in your truck for 18 months or 2 years, but there will become a time where you have to follow the new requirements.
Okay, fair enough. Let's see. We have a question that came in that is asking about the inert ingredients of a product changing from one production run to another. That's probably not something that happens as often in the 21st century, but did you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, so each pesticide that is registered is, I mentioned it has to have that confidential statement of formula. Well,
yes.
Like let's say you're going to make a cake and you put in your recipe to use only this particular brand of cake flour. You can only use this brand. But then let's say that company goes out of business and you can't get that cake flour anymore. How are you going to make your product? So oftentimes what manufacturers will do is they will submit an alternate confidential statement of formula that includes maybe a different brand of cake flour or all-purpose flour plus the addition of this ingredient that would make it more like cake flour. So as manufacturers, we have to be cognizant of the suppliers of our inert ingredients, some of those things we talked about, solvents, emulsifiers, dyes, colorants, fragrances, those things. If we buy it from only one manufacturer and that's on our CSF and that's no longer available, then we're in trouble. So like I said, cake flour brand A, cake flour brand B can be minutely different, but the EPA has to know about it.
Okay.
In our,
very good.
Not for cake flour.
Very good. Very good. Let's see. I have one more question here. It looks like should labels be removed from the container when disposing of the container properly, the triple rinse and all that?
That's a good question. I would say it depends on your state because, again, it's going to be dependent on if you recycle that bottle, that potential bottle. Most states do not allow recycling of containers that held pesticide. So I would say it doesn't really matter. But that's my opinion. I don't know the definitive answer to that.
Okay. Very good. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Reed, for sharing a new perspective on labels with us today and answering all those questions. I think we're going to wrap up now. So first, I would like to thank all of you for attending. We appreciate your time and attention. Now, Danielle Pesta has a few closing remarks for us.
Thanks, Heather. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, Labels Beyond the Basics, brought to you by Pest Management Professional Magazine and our sponsor, Control Solutions, Inc. If you have any additional questions for Heather or Dr. Reed, you can reach out to them directly via the contact information you see on the slide. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow and posted to mypmp.net/webinars. Upcoming webinars from PMP will also be posted to that page. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you'll join us again soon for another great webinar.